Hi guys, welcome back to another video on the Sign of 4. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 9, A Break in the Chain. But before we do, let's just recap Chapter 8. So Chapter 8, The Baker Street Irregulars, was a chapter that dealt mostly with class, and we got a lot of exploration of Conan Doyle's view of the working classes, as well as Holmes and Watson's view of the working classes. Additionally to that, in terms of the narrative, we found out that the killers and thieves have escaped on a boat, the Aurora, into the waterways of London, that they're potentially hiding, waiting for a quiet time in which they're going to be able to chip away with the loot. We had some further development on Athelney Jones and attitude towards the police. We saw that he'd arrested a whole load of people from Pondicherry Lodge, including Thaddeus Sholto, as well as many of his servants, which again, that helps to develop the narrative, all of which is working towards this chapter now. And like the title of the chapter suggests, this is the point where there is a break in the case. Nothing happens, no new information comes to light until the end of the chapter, and this is a very common narrative device. You'll know this from a lot of the films that you've watched. You know, you have your hero who does really, really well. And then at some point in the film, that hero has a crisis of confidence. They lose scent of what they are trying to achieve. You think about the Marvel films that you would watch, particularly, you know, if you've seen Iron Man 3, for example. So this is the point in the novel where we see Sherlock Holmes having run out of ideas, having run out of leads, kind of stuck for what to do next. And the change on his personality, the change on him physically, is definitely something to note within this chapter. Up until now, apart from the very beginning of the novel, you know, when Holmes is using all of his drugs, up until now, Holmes is a very, very confident, very, very able character. In this chapter, we kind of see Sherlock Holmes break a little bit. And this is definitely worth noting, because if Sherlock Holmes were to come up on the exam, then this would be a great chapter to talk about, because we get a contrasting view of Holmes within this chapter. Okay, just again to note, please make sure you're writing these numbers down as you go. I'm going to read through and we'll talk about some of the annotation. Okay, so it was late in the afternoon before I woke. Oh, sorry, I always do this. Just to remember as well that chapter 8 ended with Sherlock Holmes playing his violin to Watson as he slept. So this picks up straight there. Okay. It was late in the afternoon before I woke, strengthened and refreshed. Sherlock Holmes still sat exactly as I had left him, save that he had laid aside his violin and was deep in a book. He looked across at me as I stirred, and I noticed that his face was dark and troubled. "You have slept soundly," he said. "I feared that our talk would wake you." "I heard nothing," I answered. "Have you had fresh news, then?" "Unfortunately, no. I confess that I am surprised and disappointed. I expected something definite by this time. Wiggins has just been up to report. He says that no trace can be found of the launch. It is a provoking check, for every hour is of importance." "Can I do anything? I am perfectly fresh now, and quite ready for another night's outing." "No, we can do nothing. We can only wait. If we go ourselves, the message might come in our absence, and delay be caused. You can do what you will, but I must remain on guard." "Then I shall run over to Camberwell and call upon Mrs. Cecil Forrester. She asked me to yesterday." "On Mrs. Cecil Forrester?" asked Holmes, with the twinkle of a smile in his eyes. "Well, of course, Miss Morstan too. They were anxious to hear what happened." Okay, so let's just cover some of these points. So here we see, let's just deal with the title, A Break in the Chain. This links to the idea that there were no leads, that the case has stalled. It also, that foreshadows things around prisons and convicts and that kind of thing. But really, he's talking about here, the chain is the chain of events. That up until now, the events have been plodding along nicely, one after the other, one after the other. This chapter is going to be a break. So Watson wakes up strengthened and refreshed, showing that he needed that rest, but there is no rest for Holmes. He sat exactly as I had left him. Holmes has continued to stay awake, just thinking about the case. And this has led to him becoming dark and troubled. Now, this is to do with the fact that there is no news on the case, but if you think about this back in chapter 1, Holmes talks about how his mind rebels at stagnation, that he needs thinking all the time. Now, he doesn't have his thinking here. There's nothing for him to do. And so he's going back into that kind of dark, and remember again from chapter 1, what a black reaction comes upon you. Here we have darkness, the black reaction coming upon Holmes. We could again link that to light, dark imagery. Previously, we see Holmes carrying torches, carrying candles, being the person that is the guiding light. Now here we have Holmes is darkness. And again, this links to that duality. Is this part of his duality of character? It's worth thinking about. So here, I heard nothing. Watson does not hear Holmes and Wiggins's conversation. So this is Watson missing part of the narrative, linking to that idea that Watson is an unreliable narrator. We talked about this previously, but this is part of the story that Watson is completely unaware of. And in fact, in this chapter, we're going to see a couple of times where Watson is unaware of parts of the narrative that are occurring. Holmes, surprised and disappointed that nothing has come of the case, he'd expected some hard evidence by the time that Wiggins had just been up to report. This, I think, links to the idea that Holmes is kind of overconfident, maybe a little bit arrogant. He believes that his methods are so good and so watertight that if he's working on a case, he's just going to get the information. He's just going to get the evidence. And that's backed up where he calls it a provoking check to show Holmes's annoyance. A check here meaning kind of like a pushback. If you check someone on a football or a rugby field, you're kind of blocking them. And the fact that Holmes kind of personifies this a little bit by saying that it is provoking, that he sees this as a direct challenge to him, that the lack of evidence is in somehow directed to him and his abilities. You know, it shows definitely Holmes moving into this kind of black, darker period. Oh, we could do nothing, we could only wait. Boredom is going to set in. Please link this back to my mind rebels at stagnation. It's a really nice quotation to link with this here. And a nice piece of imagery, but I must remain on guard. Holmes sees himself like a soldier. He's guarding the case. He's guarding the house. He will be the person that knows straight away. He also shows, his mind is 100% on the case. Now we get a little bit of development of Watson and Mary Morstan about to come up, where Watson comments that he's going to go and see Mrs. Cecil Forrester, where Mary lives. Okay, so this is more of the difference between Holmes and Watson. Holmes, his mind is on the case. Watson, his mind is on Mary. Holmes's first reaction to the break in the chain is, I've got to stay here, and if any information comes through, I'm going to sort it out. Watson, on the other hand, there was a break in the case. He sees it as his opportunity to go and visit Mary, who he fancies. And Holmes knows this. The twinkle of a smile in his eyes. Holmes knows where Watson is going, and he knows why Watson is going there. And Watson uses the fact that they asked for an update as an excuse to go. So, again, more difference between Watson and Holmes. Not that either is bad. My overall belief is that Holmes and Watson make up two sides of the perfect detective. Holmes has the skills, the knowledge, the ability. Watson has the people skills and is able to provide empathy and sympathy when it is needed, that Holmes just couldn't. So I'll talk about that another time though. Let's continue. I would not tell them too much, said Holmes. Women are never to be entirely trusted, not the best of them. I did not pause to argue over this atrocious sentiment. I shall be back in an hour or two, I remarked. All right, good luck. But I say, if you are crossing the river, you may as well return Toby, for I don't think it is at all likely that we shall have any use for him now. I took our mongrel accordingly, and left him together with the half-sovereign at the old naturalist's in Pinchin Lane. At Camberwell I found Miss Morstan a little weary after her night's adventures, but very eager to hear the news. Mrs. Forrester, too, was full of curiosity. I told them all that we had done, suppressing, however, the more dreadful parts of the tragedy. Thus, although I spoke of Mr. Sholto's death, I said nothing of the exact manner and method of it. With all my omissions, however, there was enough to startle and amaze them. "It is a romance!" cried Mrs. Forrester. "An injured lady, 500,000 in treasure, a black cannibal, and a wooden-legged ruffian. They take the place of the conventional dragon or wicked earl. And 2 knight-errants to the rescue," added Miss Morstan with a bright glance at me. "Why, Mary, your fortune depends upon the issue of this search. I don't think that you are nearly excited enough. Just imagine what it must be to be so rich and have the world at your feet." It sent a little thrill of joy to my heart to notice that she showed no sign of elation at the prospect. On the contrary, she gave a toss of her proud head as though the matter were one in which she took small interest. Right, so with this page we have some attitude towards women, particularly Victorian attitude towards women. And just to clarify, that attitude is that women were weaker than men, they needed some sort of protection, that they couldn't deal with the realities of the world, they had to live in these kind of fantasy lands, and we'll see that as we get through. But let's start. So Holmes says, women are never to be entirely trusted. That shows us Holmes' attitude towards women. However, Watson then juxtaposes this by calling that an atrocious sentiment. So Watson is disagreeing with Holmes here. Again, this is the difference between those two characters. Holmes cannot understand why Watson would trust a woman. Watson thinks it's disgraceful that Holmes would not trust a woman. It's pretty simple. Miss Morstan, we find her tired after her night's adventures. Bearing in mind, we've looked at that word quite a few times now, adventures. There was some danger to what's been going on. And adventure, again, has connotations around colonialism, around, light-hearted fun, really. Now, Watson here tries to protect the women. He suppresses the more dreadful parts of the tragedy. He feels they are not emotionally strong enough to deal with what's actually happened. And indeed, what he does give them startle and amazes them. So they are impressed by Watson, and they are impressed by him and Holmes's abilities, skills, the risks that they're willing to take. Now here we're presented with a very stereotypical image of a woman through Mrs. Forrester. Her first place to go through this story of death and betrayal is "it is a romance." She talks about this in terms of a fairy story, an injured lady, 500,000 in treasure, black cannibal, wooden-legged ruffian, taking place of the conventional dragon or wicked earl. She sees this like a fairy story. She's not really putting together the realities and actual consequences of what is going on. Those consequences being that Thaddeus Sholto's brother was murdered, properly murdered, that Mary Morstan's father is dead, that she's only really found out a couple of nights before, potentially murdered, that she has been living this life of a governess, denied the inheritance that she was due. These are proper, real issues, yet Mrs. Forrester turns it straight away into a fairy tale romance. Now this shows an attitude towards women that they really aren't capable of dealing with the realities. Now, I'm not saying that is the case. I'm not saying that was the case then, but I believe this shows Conan Doyle's attitude towards women, and it's a very patriarchal attitude. We've talked about patriarchy before. It's a very patriarchal attitude in which Men are the gatekeepers of information, and men are rational beings who can deal with the realities of life, whereas women, they just kind of belittle and they don't see the realities. They're not capable of dealing with that. And Mary Morstan then goes on to back this up, although maybe with a little bit of sarcasm, and two knight-errants to the rescue. He sees Holmes and Watson, should be a "ner" there, Holmes and Watson as two knight-errants. These are knights in shining armour going there to rescue and defend Mary Morstan. And this develops Mary and Watson's relationship a little bit, with a little bit more about class. Watson is talking about Mary's fortune. And I'll just talk about this social situation. Watson says to just imagine what it must be to be so rich and to have the world at your feet. He's talking here about access to money, but he's also talking about access to society. Once Mary Morstan is incredibly rich, she'll be able to go out with anyone, talk with anyone, she'll be influential, all of those kinds of things. So this is Watson's main concern. And then there is a really nice juxtaposition here. It sent a little thrill of joy to my heart to notice that she showed no sign of elation at the prospect. This is a great juxtaposition. Watson feels a thrill in his heart at the fact that Mary feels no thrill in her heart. And I'd like you to remember that and to use that quotation. You know, if Mary and Watson's relationship ever does come up, that's a really nice piece of juxtaposition to note there. But, you know, it shows inevitably that Mary isn't interested in the money. She's not that bothered about being rich. Okay. It is for Mr. Thaddeus Sholto that I am anxious, she said. Nothing else is of any consequence, but I think that he has behaved most kindly and honourably throughout. It is our duty to clear him of this dreadful and unfounded charge. It was evening before I left Camberwell, and quite dark by the time I reached home. My companion's book and pipe lay by his chair, but he had disappeared. I looked about in the hope of seeing a note, but there was none. I suppose that Mr. Sherlock Holmes has gone out, I said to Mrs. Hudson, as she came up to lower the blinds. No, sir. He's gone to his room, sir. Do you know, sir, sinking her voice into an impressive whisper, I am afraid for his health. Why so, Mrs. Hudson? Well, he's that strange, sir. After you was gone, he walked up and down until I was weary of the sound of his footsteps. Then I heard him talking to himself and muttering, and every time the bell rang out, he came to the stairhead with, What is that, Mrs. Hudson? And now he has slammed off to his room, but I can hear him walking away the same as ever. I hope he's not going to be ill, sir. I ventured to say something to him about cooling medicine, but he turned on me, sir, with such a look that I don't know how I got out of the room. I don't think you have any cause to be uneasy, Mrs. Hudson, I answered. I have seen him like this before. He has some small matter upon his mind which makes him restless. I tried to speak lightly to our worthy landlady, but I was myself somewhat uneasy when through the long night I still from time to time heard the dull sound of his tread, and knew how his keen spirit was chafing against this involuntary action. All right, so just before we move on to Watson returning to Holmes, just think a little bit about how does Mary show the Victorian value of sacrifice? And again, what does this say about class? And this Victorian value of sacrifice is that, you know, you should be prepared to sacrifice some of yourself for the greater good, for the overall benefit of others. And in this we see that Mary is more concerned with helping Thaddeus. She's willing to sacrifice her claim to some of the treasure to help Thaddeus, or at least that she's not thinking about her claim to the treasure, she's thinking more about Thaddeus. Because, as she says, she believes that Thaddeus behaved most kindly and honourably throughout. And she believes that the charge is dreadful and unfounded. She doesn't believe that Thaddeus killed Bartholomew. She wants to do the right thing. Okay, so then we have some mystery developed. Watson gets back and Holmes isn't there. His pipe's in the same place, his book's in the same place, but Holmes just isn't there. And we find out from the housekeeper, Mrs. Hudson, that she's afraid that Holmes possibly is ill now. Let's think about this. The imagery, the connotation around this image of Holmes in one room, pacing up and down and up and down and walking backwards and forwards, doing these repetitive actions. This shows Holmes pacing like a caged animal. Think about tigers in zoos. If any of you have seen Tiger Man, I know that reference will be dated at some point, but Tiger Man, think about, caged animals. They pace up and down. They've nothing to do. Which then links on to the idea that maybe Holmes feels trapped by the case. Or maybe even Holmes feels trapped by the lack of progression in the case. Maybe what he wants is for things to just move forwards at such a pace that he can always be ahead, he can always be in control. Holmes has lost some of that control now. Okay. We then have references to madness, talking to himself and muttering. Victorians would definitely have seen this as a reference to mental illness. And there are some theories around Holmes and mental illness. We won't get into it too much now. We then have the verb slammed, a very violent verb showing Holmes's frustration at lack of progression with the case. And that he looked aggressively at Mrs. Hudson. He gave her such a look that she was scared. He scared her. Now, Watson has seen these mood changes often. They are quite frequent. He talks about it particularly at the beginning of the novel in reference to Holmes and his drug use. Holmes himself talks about it with reference to not being on a case. That he does have these swinging moods. But again, we end this page with more treatment of women. He tried to speak lightly to our worthy landlady. He tried to once more protect her from what's actually going on. He tried to soften his tone with her. And we then get more pacing. Now this final metaphor for this, his keen spirit was chafing against this involuntary action. His keen spirit, keen to mean passionate, but at the same time, this is a homophone. And go back. Keen here. Keen is, he really wants to get on with it, but at the same time, keen could mean sharp. With a keen blade, that means very sharp. Chafing against this involuntary action. So chafing, for those of you that might not know, let's just say for a start, this is a metaphor meaning that his personality and mind was hurt by the lack of action. Chafing, this is a rubbing action causing pain. It's a repetitive action. It's something that is very uncomfortable that usually you can't do very much about. If any of you have experienced chafing from clothing, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's really not pleasant and you just have to put up with it. So this is the metaphor showing that the case is rubbing on his mind. It's rubbing on his personality, causing him pain, causing him change. And then the idea that it's an involuntary action. It's not something that's come about because of what Sherlock Holmes has done. It's involuntary. There's just a lack of progress, and there's nothing that anyone can do about that. Okay, let's move on. At breakfast time, he looked worn and haggard, with a little fleck of feverish colour upon either cheek. "You are knocking yourself up, old man," I remarked. "I heard you marching about in the night." "No, I could not sleep," he answered. "This infernal problem is consuming me. It is too much to be balked at by so petty an obstacle, when all else had been overcome. I know the men, the launch, everything, and yet I can get no news. I have set other agencies at work, and used every means at my disposal. The whole river has been searched on either side, but there is no news, nor has Mrs. Smith heard of her husband. I shall come to the conclusion soon that they have scuttled the craft, but there are objections to that." or that Mrs. Smith has put us on a wrong scent. No, I think that may be dismissed. I had inquiries made, and there is a launch of that description. Could it have gone up the river? I have considered that possibility too. And there is a search party who will work up as far as Richmond. If no news comes today, I shall start off myself tomorrow and go for the men rather than the boat. But surely, we shall hear something. We did not, however. Not a word came to us either from Wiggins or from the other agencies. There were articles in most of the papers upon the Norwood tragedy. They all appeared to be rather hostile to the unfortunate Thaddeus Sholto. No fresh details were to be found, however, in any of them, save that an inquest was to be held upon the following day. I walked over to Camberwell in the evening to report our ill success. Okay, so let's move on. Right, so Holmes now, his change is really setting in. Far from being the bright-eyed, eager man of past, he is now worn and haggard. This shows the effects of the case are taking their toll on him. And he's very different to the Holmes at the start of the novel, very different to the Holmes that we see when this case begins. In fact, he's even looking ill, little fleck of feverish colour upon either cheek. So this lack of progress is making Holmes physically ill. More than soldier imagery, Watson talks about Holmes marching about in the night, again like a soldier. Think about all the things that relate to that imagery, all the connotations and connections with that. Infernal, another reference to hell, and that Holmes sees the problem, the case as becoming hell-like, difficult. And he sees finding the boat as petty, more and more overconfident. Just to say scuttled means to break a boat. And Holmes has very high hopes. Surely we shall hear something. He hopes that this can be moved forward. We then see a little bit around the power of the news. So all of the papers now are reporting that Thaddeus Sholto was the guy who did the murder. And we'll get more of that in a moment. Okay. A nice oxymoron, just to note. I like these little things. Ill success. This is showing that there is no luck in their efforts. Okay. Right. Oh, come on. And on my return, I found Holmes dejected and somewhat morose. He would hardly reply to my questions and busied himself all evening in an abstruse chemical analysis, which involved much heating of retorts and distilling of vapours, ending at last in a smell which fairly drove me out of the apartment. Up to the small hours of the morning, I could hear the clinking of his test tubes, which told me that he was still engaged in his malodorous experiment. In the early dawn, I woke with a start, and was surprised to find him standing by my bedside, clad in a rude sailor dress, with a pea jacket and a coarse red scarf round his neck. "I'm off down the river, Watson," said he. "I have been turning it over in my mind, and I can see only one way out of it. It is worth trying at all events." "Surely I can come with you then," said I. "No, you could be much more useful if you will remain here as my representative. I am loath to go, for it is quite on the cards that some message may come during the day, though Wiggins was despondent about it last night. I want you to open all notes and telegrams, and to act on your own judgment if any news should come." "Can I rely on you?" "Most certainly. I am afraid that you will not be able to write for me, for I can hardly tell yet where I may find myself. If I am in luck, however, I may not be gone so very long. I shall have news of some sort or other before I get back." I had heard nothing of him, but okay, I'll read that into the next page. All right, so then even more change in Holmes. Now Holmes is dejected. He's not interested in the case anymore, and morose to mean sullen and ill-tempered. That he busied himself all evening in an abstruse chemical analysis. This shows us that to relax, Holmes does chemistry. Rather than just taking the sensible step and having a sleep. Bear in mind, he's probably not slept for 4 days by now. Rather than just rest and have a sleep, Holmes continues to work. And again, this fits in with that Victorian maxim that we have talked about before. A change is as good as a rest. If you are stuck with something, if you are fed up with something, rather than rest, just change the thing you're doing. And we see this all the way through the novel. Holmes writing papers, being a detective, playing the violin, being a boxer. I've talked about this so many times. This is just another thing to add to Holmes's list of skills. So Holmes was up to the small hours of the morning, hearing the clinking of his test tubes, told me he was still engaged in his melodious experiment. Even when doing this experiment, Holmes still has not been to bed. And even now, when Watson wakes up, he finds Holmes standing next to his bed. He's still not been to sleep. But he is in disguise, which adds a certain level of mystery to the story. Why? Why is Holmes in disguise? Okay, and we see here that Holmes is determined to do the job of the Baker Street irregulars himself. He's going down the river. He's going to see what he can find out. Here we see that Holmes wants Watson to stay at home. Now, this could be read in one of two ways. Holmes asks him to act on your own judgment if any news should come, and he says that he'll be more useful if you will remain here as my representative. Now, this might be that Holmes genuinely needs someone at Baker Street to represent him, to open post, to make contacts. It also might be Holmes kind of shrugging Watson off for this little mission. He needs to be discreet. He's going undercover. He can't go undercover with Watson because Watson isn't the most discreet character. So it could be either one of those things. Further mystery developed that Holmes doesn't even know where he's going to go, doesn't know what's happening. Okay, let's continue from this bottom paragraph. So I'd heard nothing of him by breakfast time. On opening the Standard, however, I found that there was a fresh allusion to the business with reference to Upper Norwood. Just to say before we move on, this is going to mark another shift in the narrative perspective. This is more news, more articles in newspapers that help to develop Athelney Jones's narrative without Athelney Jones really being in the story too much. It's the Norwood tragedy. It remarked, "We have reason to believe that the matter promises to be even more complex and mysterious than was originally supposed. Fresh evidence has shown that it is quite impossible that Mr. Thaddeus Sholto could have been in any way concerned with the matter. He and the housekeeper, Mrs. Burnston, were both released yesterday evening. It is believed, however, that the police have a clue as to the real culprits, and that it is being prosecuted by Mr. Athelney Jones of Scotland Yard with all his well-known energy and sagacity. Further arrests may be expected at any moment." That is satisfactory, so far as it goes, thought I. Friend Sholto is safe, at any rate. I wonder what the fresh clue may be, though it seems to be a stereotyped form whenever the police have made a blunder. I tossed the paper down upon the table, but at that moment my eye caught an advertisement in the agony column. It ran in this way: "Lost. Whereas Mordecai Smith, boatman, and his son Jim left Smith's Wharf at or about 3 o'clock last Tuesday morning in the steam launch Aurora, black with 2 red stripes, funnel black with a white band. The sum of £5 will be paid to anyone who can give information to Mrs. Smith at Mrs. Smith's Wharf or at 221B Baker Street as to the whereabouts of the said Mordecai Smith and the launch Aurora." This was clearly Holmes's doing. The Baker Street address was enough to prove that. It struck me as rather ingenious, because it might be read by the fugitives without their seeing in it more than the natural anxiety of a wife for her missing husband. Okay. So now we get a little bit more attitude towards the police. And I'd like to just think about this. How are the articles used as narrative devices? How does the inclusion of these articles allow us to get narrative outside of Watson's narrative and find out about characters, like I say, that aren't actually really in the novel very much? I mean, just focus on that. Make a few notes at the top of your page. So we see then that Athelney Jones's original story has finally been taken to pieces, that it has finally been contradicted. by the article, saying that it's quite impossible Mr. Thaddeus Sholto could have been any way concerned in the matter. Now, this might be Jones actually doing the detective work. It also might be Thaddeus Sholto being able to pull out a pretty decent alibi. You know, he was in a house with his servant, Kit McGarr, when all of this was going on. So he does have an alibi. He does have a witness. I just want you to focus on this at the top. So where it talks about how the paper It remarked, this is personification of the newspaper, making it a character that impacts the narrative of the story. The newspaper in this way works as a narrator. It's giving us details of the plot without Watson having a hand in it. Now, this personification may also link to the idea that the newspapers are important, that whatever views the newspapers put out tends to be seen as reality. However, despite all of this, noting that Athelney Jones got it wrong, the newspaper is still behind Athelney Jones and by virtue of the police. As it comments, Mr. Athelney Jones of Scotland Yard, with all his well-known energy and sagacity. Now, sagacity, that means wisdom. A sage would be an elderly person who has lots and lots of wisdom, who is able to offer advice. Now that is what they're saying about Athelney Jones. Now again, this is dramatic irony. We know Athelney Jones has very little energy. We know when it comes to wisdom, Athelney Jones has very little, which kind of backs up Conan Doyle's view of the police, that they are fairly incompetent. Yeah, so I wonder what the fresh clue may be, though it seems to be a stereotyped form whenever the police have made a blunder. So this is the idea that the police have this one kind of document that they put out whenever they've made a mistake. This highlights the fact they maybe make a lot of mistakes. This also highlights the fact that maybe they don't learn from those mistakes, you know. But it talks here that the police identify fresh clues to cover up those mistakes. You know, they're saying now that the things that Holmes already knew, well, we've discovered those things, and so we know really what's going on now. We then have a separate article from Holmes, which again develops the narrative, which again works as kind of a trap for finding out information about the Aurora. Wicked. Let's continue. So it was a long day. I'll start from here. It was a long day. Every time that a knock came to the door or a sharp step passed the street, I imagined that it was either Holmes returning or an answer to his advertisement. I tried to read, but my thoughts would wander off to our strange quest and to the ill-assorted and villainous pair whom we were pursuing. Could there be, I wondered, some radical flaw in my companion's reasoning? Might he be suffering from some huge self-deception? Was it not possible that his nimble and speculative mind had built up this wild theory upon faulty premises? I have never known him to be wrong, and yet the keenest reasoner may occasionally be deceived. He was likely, I thought, to fall into error through the over-refinement of his logic, his preference for a subtle and bizarre explanation when a plainer and more commonplace one lay ready to his hand. Yet on the other hand, I had myself seen the evidence, and I had heard the reasons for his deductions. When I look back on the long chain of curious circumstances, many of them trivial in themselves, but all tending in the same direction, I could not disguise from myself that even if Holmes's explanation were incorrect, the true theory must be equally hauteur and startling. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, there was a loud peal at the bell, an authoritative voice in the hall, and to my surprise, no less a person than Mr. Athelney Jones was shown up to me. Very different was he, however, from the brusque and masterful professor of common sense who had taken over the case so confidently at Upper Norwood. His expression was downcast, and his bearing meek and even apologetic. "Good day, sir, good day," said he. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes is out, I understand." "Yes, and I cannot be sure when he will be back, but perhaps you will care to wait." Okay, let's go through this then. So here we get a lot of Watson's kind of internal monologue, a lot of Watson's internal thoughts, and these help to develop the mystery. Because remember, Watson all along has struggled to understand what's really going on, and so when left to his own devices, he kind of just becomes more and more confused. Just to make a comment, Watson is trying to read. This is middle class entertainment. This puts him very much within the middle classes. He comments that it is a strange quest. He talks about Jonathan Small and Tonga as an ill-assorted and villainous pair. And his musings lead him to start to doubt Holmes's abilities. Watson thinks, might he be suffering from some huge self-deception? Might Holmes be trying to convince himself that he is right? But then Watson notes that he'd never known him to be wrong, so kind of he juxtaposes this idea straight away. Watson talks about how Holmes likes complexity, his preference for a subtle and bizarre explanation when a plainer and more commonplace one lay ready to his hand. Holmes likes to make things more difficult than they actually are. He calls the mystery a long chain of curious circumstances. Develops the mystery even more, that even if Holmes's explanation were incorrect, the true theory must be equally auteur and startling. So this word auteur means unusual and shocking. And really Watson here is developing mystery by saying that regardless of the explanation, whether Holmes is right or wrong, it is a really, really strange and mysterious case. Now we are introduced again to Athelney Jones proper. We see him physically. And in the same way that Sherlock Holmes is changed by the case, Athelney Jones is changed by the case. As we get towards the end of the novel, we will see that Athelney Jones and Sherlock Holmes, their characters overlap a lot more. They are kind of similar people in that they both deal with catching criminals. So I think this links back to the saying in the Pondicherry Lodge that there is no fool as dangerous as he who has some wit. Holmes recognises that there is something in Athelney Jones that is a bit similar to him, but generally he's not. But he is here. Watson, using irony and sarcasm to get kind of a backhanded insult in against Athelney Jones, saying that he was far from the brusque and masterful professor of common sense. We know that he is neither of these things. And that is why Watson can say it. It's like an in-joke between us and Watson, the narrator. And his expression was downcast, bearing meek and even apologetic. So Athelney Jones has also come to a break in the case. His reaction makes him like Holmes, like I say. Now, we need to think a little bit about why here is Athelney Jones made into a more sympathetic character. Why do we go from this figure of ridicule, this joke of a policeman, to this policeman who now, and as we see towards the end of the book, is going to be kind of on the side of Holmes and Watson? I think it fits into three categories. The first is it sets up the final confrontation. Athelney Jones is going to be there for the final confrontation. He has to be. He's the guy that's going to arrest Jonathan Small. So, yeah, Athelney Jones needs to be on Watson and Holmes' side, because if he's not, he can't be there for the final confrontation. This also shows a united British force versus crime. So even though Athelney Jones and Sherlock Holmes didn't really get on in the first encounter, by the end of the novel, they are united against crime and against this criminal. It could also be seen as a united British force against colonial indigenous people. not that Jonathan Small is, but his partner is, and Jonathan Small definitely is working for those kind of guys. And finally, the idea that he and Holmes are in some ways similar, that they do have these certain similar traits. Okay. So yes, and I cannot be sure when he will be back, but perhaps you will care to wait. Take that chair and try one of these cigars. Sorry? Thank you. I don't mind if I do, said he, mopping his face with a red bandana handkerchief. And a whisky and soda? Well, half a glass. It is very hot for the time of year, and I have had a good deal to worry and try me. You know my theory about this Norwood case. I remember that you expressed one. Well, I have been obliged to reconsider it. I had my net drawn tightly round Mr. Sholto, sir, when pop he went through a hole in the middle of it. He was able to prove an alibi which could not be shaken. From the time that he left his brother's room he was never out of the sight of someone or other, so it could not be he who climbed over roofs and through trapdoors. It is a very dark case, and my professional credit is at stake. I should be very glad of a little assistance. We all need help sometimes, said I. Your friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, is a wonderful man, sir, said he in a husky and confidential voice. He's a man who is not to be beat. I have known that young man go into a good many cases, but I never saw the case yet that he could not throw a light upon. He is irregular in his methods, a little quick, perhaps, in jumping at theories, but on the whole I think he would have made a most promising officer, and I don't care who knows it. I have had a wire from him this morning, by which I understand that he has got some clue to the Sholto business. Here is the message. He took the telegram out of his pocket and handed it to me. It was dated from Poplar at 12 o'clock. Go to Baker Street at once, it said. If I have not returned, wait for me. We'll just go on here in a second. So, thinking again, we have light dark imagery within this chapter. We need to focus on the meaning of that light dark imagery, the image, which characters the lightness and the darkness is attached to. Before we do, the cigar. So this is a symbol of wealth, also a symbol of the patriarchy. A cigar is a phallic image, and we have talked a little bit about phallic imagery when looking at Macbeth, but here we have some here. And I think it definitely is a symbol of the patriarchy, and Athelney Jones accepting a cigar from Watson shows that they are in the same club. They are both part of the patriarchy. They are both going to use their power and influence and might to capture Jonathan Small and restore balance. All right, a lot to get from that cigar, but you have to keep an eye out for these things. Okay, Athelney Jones mopping his face with a red bandana handkerchief. Athelney Jones, he's still unhealthy, and he drinks. He's drinking booze on the job. Right, so Athelney Jones now has changed his opinion. He's been obliged to reconsider it. I had my net drawn tightly round Mr. Sholto. This again, this very simplistic metaphor that Athelney Jones has used before, could comment on his intelligence, his creativity, his flexibility of thought. All of those things. Now we have some dark imagery. In the same way that Watson feels that it gets darker by the minute. We looked at that before when he talks about the case. Athelney Jones now says it's a very dark case. He believes that there is not much evidence, that it is difficult to solve, or it could be that it is of a scary nature. All three of those things are relevant, and I think if this were to come up, you should really be trying to talk about all of it. But yeah, not much evidence, it is difficult to solve, or it is a scary case. Athelney Jones is also worried about his professional credit. That he is worried about his status and how people are going to see him. We have an absolute changed opinion when he says that Holmes is a wonderful man and that he never saw a case that he could not throw light upon. Now, this is the lightness with this light dark imagery. If the case is dark to Athelney Jones, he recognises that Holmes is the person to bring light to darkness, that Holmes is the person to shed some light on what's actually going on with this case. Okay, let's continue. So he took the telegram out of his pocket and handed it to me. It was dated. Okay. If I have not returned, wait for me. I'm close on the track of the Sholto gang. Oops, sorry. You can come with us tonight if you want to be in at the finish. This sounds well. He has evidently picked up the scent again, said I. Ah, then he has been at fault too, exclaimed Jones, with evident satisfaction. Even the best of us are thrown off sometimes. Of course, this may prove to be a false alarm, but it is my duty as an officer of the law to allow no chance to slip. But there is someone at the door. Perhaps this is he. A heavy step was heard ascending the stair, with a great wheezing and rattling, as from a man who was sorely put to it for breath. Once or twice he stopped, as though the climb were too much for him, but at last he made his way to our door and entered. His appearance corresponded to the sounds which we had heard. He was an aged man, clad in seafaring garb, with an old pea jacket buttoned up to his throat. His back was bowed, his knees were shaky, and his breathing was painfully asthmatic. As he leaned upon a thick oaken cudgel, his shoulders heaved in an effort to draw the air into his lungs. He had a coloured scarf round his chin, and I could see little of his face, save a pair of keen, dark eyes, overhung by bushy white brows and long grey side whiskers. Altogether, he gave me the impression of a respectable master mariner who had fallen into years and poverty. "What is it, my man?" I asked. He looked about him in a slow, methodical fashion of old age. "Is Mr. Sherlock Holmes here?" said he. Okay, we'll stop there. So this is the note that Athelney Jones has received. If you want to be in it at the finish, this foreshadows a chase. Maybe that there is going to be a chase. It also has imagery that is connected to races, which links to it being a game for Holmes, also links to it being kind of a competition. Holmes is competing against the criminals. We then have further animal imagery linking Holmes to a bloodhound, that he picked up the scent again. And Athelney Jones believes that Holmes is off the case too. He recognises that they are in a similar situation, and again this links to the idea that Holmes and Athelney Jones are in some ways similar. Now we get this scene. Personally, I find this next bit quite annoying. I find Holmes's behaviour to be quite childish. We'll unpick that as we go. Please note though, this is Holmes in disguise, and there are a few clues. And I mean, just to add, this is something to add to the long list of things that Holmes is amazing at. He's amazing at disguises. He even manages to fool Athelney Jones and Watson. So Holmes changes his appearance. He gives a heavy step. He wheezes and rattles. Maybe this is him poking a little bit of fun at Athelney Jones, and maybe this seems like him walking up the stairs in the way that Athelney Jones would walk up the stairs. But he's pretending to be a dock worker. Now, here are our little clues. As an audience, we can use observation, deduction, and knowledge to see through this disguise. We can observe things. He's wearing a pea jacket. Watson talked about Holmes wearing a pea jacket. He is dressed in seafaring garb. Watson talked about seeing Holmes in seafaring garb. We can deduce that Holmes has been to the docks. That's where he sent the Baker Street Irregulars, so we can deduce that Holmes has been down to the docks. Now our knowledge fits in here. I could see little of his face save a pair of keen, dark eyes. We know that Holmes has these keen, shiny eyes, and indeed the eyes juxtapose everything else about this disguise, and they are indeed the only thing that Holmes could not disguise were his eyes. So we're presented with the image of an old sailor who has fallen down in his luck, isn't doing very well, yet he has these very sharp, sparkly eyes. Through knowledge, we can say, this is Holmes. Okay, now Holmes here is playing a trick on them. He asks, is Mr. Sherlock Holmes? home. And this shows him very much playing a trick on both Jones and Watson. So a message you have for him. It was to him myself I was to tell it, said he, but I tell you that I am acting for him. Was it about Mordecai Smith's boat? Yes, I know well where it is, and I knows where the men is. And I knows where the money is after all, and I knows where the treasure is. I knows all about it. Then tell me, and I shall let him know. It was to him I was to tell it, he repeated, with the petulant obstinacy of a very old man. Well, you must wait for him. No, I ain't going to lose a whole day to please no one. If Mr. Holmes ain't here, then Mr. Holmes must find it all out for himself. I don't care about the look of either of you, and I won't tell a word. He shuffled towards the door, but Athelney Jones got in front of him. Wait a bit, my friend, said he. You have important information, and you must not walk off. We shall keep you, whether you like it or not, until our friend returns. The old man made a little run towards the door, but as Athelney Jones put his broad back up against it, he recognised the uselessness of resistance. Pretty sort of treatment, this, he cried, stamping his stick. I come here to see a gentleman, and you two, who I never saw in my life, seize me and treat me in this fashion. You'll be none the worse, I said. We shall recompense you for the loss of your time. Sit over here on the sofa, and you will not have long to wait. All right, let's, just as we're going through, think a little bit about why does Holmes play this trick, and again, how could we use more observation, deduction, knowledge to work out who it is. I'm going to leave you guys to do that yourselves. Holmes reveals here that he knows what's happening. He knows what's going on with the plot. And he behaves with the petulant obstinacy of a very old man. This again shows that Holmes is able to completely change his character, developing the idea of mystery. At this point, this boatman, if you haven't worked out that it was Holmes, it's pretty strange that he's just rocked up at Holmes's house. He came across sullenly enough and seated himself with his face resting on his hands. Jones and I resumed our cigars and our talk. Suddenly, however, Holmes's voice broke in upon us. I think that you might offer me a cigar too, he said. We both started in our chairs. There was Holmes sitting close to us with an air of quiet amusement. Holmes, I exclaimed, you here? But where is the old man? Here is the old man, said he, holding out a heap of white hair. Here he is, wig, whiskers, eyebrows and all. I thought my disguise was pretty good, but I hardly expected that it would stand the test. Ah, you rogue, cried Jones, highly delighted. You would have made an actor, and a rare one. You had the proper workhouse cough, and those weak legs of yours are worth £10 a week. I thought I knew the glint of your eye, though. You didn't get away from us so easily, you see. I have been working in that get-up all day, said he, lighting his cigar. You see, a good many of the criminal classes begin to know me, especially since our friend here took to publishing some of my cases. So I can only go on the warpath under some simple disguise like this. You got my wire? Yes, that was what brought me here. How has your case prospered? It has all come to nothing. I have had to release 2 of my prisoners, and there is no evidence against the other 2. Never mind. We shall give you 2 others in place of them. But you must put yourself under my orders. You are welcome to all the official credit, but you must act on the line I point out. Is that agreed? Okay, so then Holmes reveals his disguise. Watson is totally fooled. Again, this shows difference between Holmes and Watson. The fact that Holmes is able to fool Watson, that Watson cannot see through Holmes's disguise. Holmes here showing more detective skills, showing how able he is to disguise himself, all that kind of stuff. But then we get some kind of shocking attitude towards the poor. And again, this links with class. Athelney Jones talks about Holmes having the proper workhouse cough. This reference to workhouses, this is where you would be sent if you were in debt or if you were an orphan. And it would be, you would wake up and work and work and work and work until it was time to go to sleep. You'd be given very little food. Illness rife within workhouses. And Athelney Jones making a glib comment about, you've got the proper workhouse cough. You managed to imitate these poor, unfortunate people. However, Here we see that Jones does have some detective skills when he says, "I thought I knew the glint of your eye, though." Exactly what we were talking about the previous page. The only thing Holmes can't disguise is his eyes, and Athelney Jones was able to spot that, even though he couldn't see through the rest of the disguise. Right, so Holmes, when justifying wearing a disguise, he talks about how the criminal classes know him since our friend here took to publishing some of my cases. This is an additional fourth wall break where he's talking about Watson writing The Study in Scarlet and the subsequent books that Watson will go on to write. But at this point, it's only this book and The Study in Scarlet. So here Holmes is referencing the fact that Watson is writing books that are going out into the real world. So this breaks the fourth wall, that invisible barrier between fiction and reality. So here, when talking about losing two of his suspects, Holmes says, "We shall give you two others in the place of them." This links to the idea that Holmes now once again believes it will be easy to catch Jonathan Small and Tonga, but at the same time it has connotations around it being like a gift, that he can wrap them up, get them ready, give them to Athelney Jones when the time is right, exactly as you would a gift. So I think that once more links to Holmes's confidence, whether you think it's overconfidence or not. It's definitely his confidence in his own abilities. "Entirely, if you will help me to the men. Well then, in the first place, I shall want a fast police boat, a steam launch, to be at the Westminster Stairs at 7 o'clock. That is easily managed. There is always one about there, but I can step across the road and telephone to make sure. Then I shall want 2 staunch men, in case of resistance. There will be 2 or 3 in the boat. What else? When we secure the men, we shall get the treasure. I think that it will be a pleasure to my friend here to take the box round to the young lady to whom half of it rightfully belongs. Let her be the first to open it, eh, Watson?" "It will be a great pleasure to me." "Rather an irregular proceeding," said Jones, shaking his head. "However, the whole thing is irregular, and I suppose we must wink at it. The treasure must afterwards be handed over to the authorities until after the official investigation." "Certainly, that is easily managed. One other point. I should much like to have a few details about this matter from the lips of Jonathan Small himself. You know I like to work the detail of my cases out. There is no objection to my having an unofficial interview with him, either here in my rooms or elsewhere, as long as he is efficiently guarded." "Well, you are master of the situation. I have had no proof yet of the existence of this Jonathan Small." Okay. So, just a few points to make. Here, Holmes is helping out Watson. Holmes is helping out Watson by saying, "Watson, you take the treasure round to Mary Morstan's house first." This is more development of Mary and Watson's relationship. He says it would be a great pleasure to do so. Athelney Jones talks about the case being irregular, but then the whole thing is irregular. And to wink at it means to ignore it. So Athelney Jones is saying, this is a strange situation, so I can ignore a little bit of strangeness. Here we see that Holmes wants to hear Jonathan Small's confession. And for me, I think this is Holmes's ultimate goal. He's pieced the case together. He's worked this out. He's worked that out. He's got his ideas. The only way to know whether he is 100% correct is to have time to sit down with Jonathan Small and talk it through. And I think that is what is most important to Holmes. Have I got this correct? Okay, last page. So, however, if you can catch him, I don't see how I can refuse an interview with him. That is understood then. Perfectly. Is there anything else? Only that I insist upon your dining with us. It will be ready in half an hour. I have oysters and a brace of grouse, with something a little choice in white wines. Watson, you have never yet recognised my merits as a housekeeper. Okay, so we end here with a reference to class and patriarchy. Let's just quickly cover the class. So oysters, grouse, white wine, these are expensive goods in Victorian society. that most people would not have access to, indicating somewhat that Holmes and Watson and Athelney Jones maybe are all living in this upper middle to upper class world. However, this also massively talks about the patriarchy. And I'm just going to read this, although it's there. Consider the image of three men plotting against a weaker man and how to use his treasure to further a relationship that is one of theirs. So in this scenario, we've got Watson, Holmes and Athelney Jones sat around a dinner table, eating their fine food, plotting how they're going to take down this weaker man in Jonathan Small. Admittedly, he is a criminal, but in the eyes of society, he is other. He is underclass. And please do bear in mind that the patriarchy can also work against men. The patriarchy aren't solely concerned with women and suppressing women. They're solely concerned with preserving the power of powerful men, which means they can subjugate women and they can subjugate working class men at the same time. You know, I think this is a problem that we have today, that people don't recognise this, that the patriarchy only has the values of the patriarchy at heart. It isn't even the value of all men. So in this instance, Jonathan Small represents that weaker man that these three guys are going to go after. Alongside this, think about the fact that they're plotting about how they can remove this treasure from Jonathan Small, give it to Watson, and then Watson will take that treasure to Mary Morstan, and that will in some way develop their relationship. You know, they're deciding Mary's future. They are manipulating her in a way by sending Watson there with the treasure in the first place. They are denying Jonathan Small's future with the treasure. Yeah, it's just something to bear in mind that within this chapter particularly, we tend to see men grouped together behaving in manly ways. And then finally, this is work for yourselves. I'd like to make some notes on this across the bottom of this page, because this is the last time we'll see him truly. I mean, he will be in the other chapters, but not in as much detail as this. I want to think about, how does the character of Athelney Jones change across the novel? So from that very first time we see him in Pondicherry Lodge to right now, how has the character of Athelney Jones changed? Okay, and that's it. That's chapter 9. 3 chapters to go, 10, 11 and 12. We're going to get there, guys. Okay, I hope you're all staying safe, continue to do the work, and I will speak to you all again soon. Cheers, bye.